Aotearoa's Hauraki Gulf Marine Park, Tikapa Moana and Te Moana Nui Ātoi, stretching from Te Arai to Waihi. Beautiful, biodiverse, unique in our world. A treasure for tangata whenua, it's always provided what we love and what we need. From above it looks spectacular, but beneath the surface, it's a different story. It's actually on the brink of ecological collapse. How did this happen? And what can we do? In this series, we'll take a deep dive into the Hauraki Gulf to understand what is making our sea sick. We've talked about what's been taken out of the Hauraki Gulf. In this episode, we look at what's been going in. Paru o pollution. Dirty, dirty, dirty.
I had always known that sediment was a problem in the Hauraki Gulf, but I was really alarmed to see the scale of the sediment problem that we have. And often people think that it's just the sediment coming into the Firth of Thames through the Waihi and the Piako rivers. But actually a ton of sediment, or tons, or millions of tons of sediment comes out of activities in Auckland City, where I'm not entirely sure how you get away with being able to dump clay right on the edges of stream banks and river banks, because on the next deluge, and let's be honest, it's Auckland, there will always be a deluge in the next couple of weeks, it's going to wash that all into the oceans. And so our streams and our estuaries and then our nearshore marine environments are being smothered to death, they're being choked out. I think that's probably one of our biggest challenges.
The Hauraki Gulf's had 170 plus years of massive amounts of sediment pouring into it. I think it's probably started not long after me arrived in New Zealand, you know, as soon as we started clearing trees and clearing land.
Well, I mean, this has been going on since the forest was removed hundreds of years ago, but, you know, and it's been exacerbated over the years with more and more forest removal, with agriculture, with farming.
Gold mining was sort of a major impact, where all the tailings from the mines were just dumped into the rivers. We then cleared the Hauraki Plains, one of New Zealand's largest wetlands, and turned it into farms.
There's so many things going wrong. Our systems that have created our farming have gone wrong. Farmers are good people, they want to do good things. They've just been given a wrong pathway to follow.
To protect the Gulf, we also need to change the practices on the land, because that's leading to this huge plume of sediment and nitrogen into the Gulf, which inevitably makes its way north. So we do also need to change the way we do agriculture in order to protect the marine environment, because surprise, surprise, these things are connected.
It's all been about drainage, so we've been trying to get the water off the land as quickly as possible. When it rains and you're generating sediments, all those sediments are flushed very quickly down to the sea. What we've stopped the rivers from doing is being able to flood out over to floodplains where they would trap that sediment and stop it from ending up in the Gulf.
And so it's really important for us to restore wetlands so that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground again.
The old people used to call the tikarahi, those wetlands, the kidneys of the fish before it went back into tikapa moana. So what happens when your kidneys don't work anymore? Your puku gets sore, your stomach gets sore, and you start to get sick. You know, so that's the kōrero of my old people. So
it's a one-way street. Once it gets into our harbours, there's very little we can do to get rid of it.
Letting rivers be rivers is one of the things that, you know, what it requires is quite a massive change in land use practices.
And it's all about what you're doing in those canals and what you're doing with buffers between the pasture and the canal and all the rest. You know, there's stuff that can be done, no problem.
And so how can we learn from how a river behaves in its natural cycles, how it spreads out into a floodplain and then shrinks back in? And so what we want to be turning towards is working with nature instead of against nature.
So the mangroves grow really well in this part of the country, and they're binding a lot of that sediment. They're keeping it locked up in those high shore areas. So that's a really useful thing that they're doing for the rest of the harbour. This is just nature working for us, doing what it's doing, but we're benefiting from that.
And my marae here actually used to get its drinking water, as I said, out of the river here. That's how clean it was. So the river was another part of our playground. So we'd get freshwater mussels out of the river, catch tuna with our hands in the weeds, go and pick watercress, go and pick puha. The kōrero about what's happening in Te Moana is not a new one. Our old people said you cannot do something on the land that's detrimental because it will impact back in the moana, or in the moana it will impact back on the land.
What can we do to get rid of the paru? What can we do better?
One of the dreams of my iwi is to have a green corridor that comes from this place right in the middle of the wetlands all the way out to the sea as it used to be. And again, to encourage the wildlife, the bird life to come back in these particular areas.
We've got to start somewhere, right?
Aye.
So we start planting these areas out. The roots will go in and hold the riverbanks together. That will stop the sedimentation to a large degree from going into the water. There's been a bunch of restoration planting happen here over the years, and we're here to collect a bunch of kakano, so seeds. Within this area we've got several different species that we're wanting to grow that will then help us clean up the water quality in the catchment above here. This plant is actually a really special one. It's a wetland plant called a Waihi. These stalks drop down into the water. 1 square metre of constructed wetland will clean up the wastewater of 1 human. These are some of these regenerative design solutions that could fix a lot of our issues that are impacting the Gulf here.
We've gifted space to our local iwi to do native seed nursery. So we hope to be doing 50,000 seeds per year. And then back on the marae, they're going to be doing a mara, and it's just like, what more could you ask for, really? So for us just to be involved and to provide space and to be a small part of it all is everything to us.
What I don't want to have happen when I'm not here is that my great-grandchildren pick up and they look at our river and say, what did those old buggers do about this?
Natural cures for nature's ills. Tahua. Beautiful. What about the blue and more northern end of the Gulf? How's that looking?
Here we are on Maharani Harbour. Where we're standing right now, we're looking out across a mud flat, and we can see lots of old shellfish shells in the sediment surface. There's no signs of live shellfish here, so we can imagine that in the past this place would have been a really abundant and productive shellfish habitat. It's changed over time because of the sediment that's come into the harbour from the adjacent land. So you would have been happily sitting on the seafloor as a baby cockle. You would have been sucking hard on the water column, pulling food out of the water column. Clouds of silt would be going over the top of you and you'd be choking on those clouds of silt. Life is hard for you. And then one day, a great slug of mud would have come down the harbour, it would have landed on top of you and smothered you, and you would have died.
Oh, that doesn't sound good. Stink for our shellfish. But there's heaps of people who need heaps of houses all over the place. What's the cost of that?
The modern way of development is to get in there and clear the land, trying to maximise the number of units you get into your land, and that requires you to level out the contours. And one of the key things it does is actually exposes to weather events. Sediment isn't a one-off thing, it's a cumulative over time thing.
Every time there's a new bit of earthworks, a new development takes place, unless that sediment is managed on site, if that sediment gets washed into the harbour, that attracts a lot of contamination as well.
I acknowledge that there's a real challenge in Auckland because we have a housing crisis and we need more houses, but Building more houses and intensification naturally comes hand in hand with environmental degradation.
Look at all this mud. It washes down the catchment from areas where it shouldn't be dumped off building sites and ends up choking all of our shellfish. They can't live in mud, eh? It needs to stop. So we're in the Long Bay Okada Marine Reserve, which is the largest estuarine marine reserve in the country. It's a really important part of the Hauraki Gulf. It's still got good populations of filter-feeding shellfish like pippies and cockles, which play a really important role in filtering out the water for the entire Gulf. Now, over the years, we've seen large amounts of fine sediment coming from clay and exposed dirt from development building sites and from areas where it's being dumped, washing into our waterways and ending up in this estuary, choking the life, and going out into the Hauraki Gulf where it's wreaking havoc. So 1 millimetre of fine sediment is enough to choke out seagrass. And seagrass is really important. It's where fish spawn, eggs, a whole community of sea life rely on a seagrass forest. One of the trends seems to be putting rain gardens in, so when the stormwater comes in, instead of all going down the same stormwater hole, goes into these pits. Here's a drain that flows to the sea. When it rains, it's all going to the Gulf.
Particularly Auckland Council has put a lot of effort into trying to manage sediment runoff from those development sites, but it's just such a challenging issue.
So a core component of Hobsonville Point design was the integration of amenity in the urban fabric and using that amenity to manage stormwater and contaminants for water runoff that comes from this site. So the idea is to slow the water down so the sediment can fall out, right? So the example behind me is a stormwater detention pond. The way it works is that stormwater sits here and is slowed down, so contaminants fall from the water and the plants are selected to help in that contaminant removal before the stormwater eventually ends up in the harbour.
Come on, let's find out where the go is with our 100-year-old sewerage system. I've seen too many warnings all over Auckland beaches because of poo. Too much tickle is not okay.
If you go right back to Auckland when it was settled in the late 1800s, the initial network that got put into Auckland was what's known as a combined network. And so initially where Kelly Tarleton's is at the moment was where the wastewater was collected that got discharged directly into the harbour.
At that time, best practice was the solution to pollution is dilution. Simply put, what Auckland flushed in the city washed out to sea in the outgoing tide down here at Okahu Bay. It was dumping raw, more or less untreated sewage into the Hauraki Gulf.
In the 1960s, they built the Mangere wastewater treatment plant, but the old part of Auckland were all what's known as combined areas.
The thinking at the time was that you put your wastewater alongside your stormwater in a big pipe. From time to time, when there might be a heavy rainfall, in order to save costs, we'll just do one pipe and there might be a little overflow, but that'll be okay. Today, it rained about 3 days ago and I'm sure the E. coli count would have been too high for us to swim. Personally, I wait for 3 days after a heavy rain anywhere in Auckland before I'll swim. So I have to acknowledge though that Watercare and the Auckland Council's combined kind of billions of dollars worth of investment into shifting and separating our stormwater and our wastewater. They're putting their hands up and saying, this was done, but now we're going to fix it.
So the whole intention with the new Central Interceptor is Watercare is building this massive new stormwater pipe that's going all the way to Mangere. That will then be treated at Mangere and discharged to a very high quality into the Manukau Harbour. Cox's Bay is what I consider to be the key KPI for that project. The goal is that in 2028, Cox's Bay will be swimmable. And you wouldn't get a more contaminated and dirty part of the harbour than Cox's Bay. So if we can control sediment, which deals with the ecology of the harbour, and public health through the wastewater management, we're 95% of the way towards solving the problem.
We have to learn from our past mistakes. Take a look at how our shameful past has been turned around in Okahu Bay.
Tūturu e rangi e tui hone, tūturu e papa e takatone, ka whakamaua kia tīna. Tēnā! Uie! Tai ki e! Tēnā tātou.
Okahu Bay has got a history of paru, really dirty. So we started with cleaning the bay out, no more boats in there, so no more poisons coming off the boats, no more leaking of diesel or whatever. But we're still stuck with some paru, and what we need to do is try and come up with ways of filtering the water.
So Revive Our Gulf's mission is to bring back 500 kilometres squared of the mussels, because they used to be all over the Hauraki Gulf seabed.
They would have been able to filter the entire Firth of Thames, that whole massive waterway. They were able to do that in one day. So they're really, really amazing little filtering machines. I like to think that if I designed one of these little self-replicating filtering machines, I'd get a Nobel Prize. They're absolutely amazing.
And now today, mussel beds or mussel reefs are functionally extinct.
We had commercial boats out here that pretty much rolled them up like a carpet and took them off, and by 1960 the mussel beds were gone.
My dad taught me and my siblings that if you love something you have to take care of it, and taking care of it for us meant action.
Each of those buoys is a mussel bed, so if you can try and position as if the buoy is the centre of the mussel bed. Does that make sense? So 10 tonnes on each area. Over.
So what we've done in Okahu Bay, we've used a shell bed, and then we've put live mussels on top of that, and that's actually given them a really nice hard platform for them to grow.
You know, when I saw those mussels, I just felt joy. I felt good. I felt this is worth everything. A reparation of colonial activity. This is putting right the wrong of yesteryear.
So far we've heard about ecosystem destruction and that we've taken too much out of the Hauraki Gulf. And pollution's been added to the mix of issues. Seriously, we've got our work cut out. But in the next episode, prepare to be enlightened. Te ao Māori to the rescue. Cheer!